All right. So let's talk about, before we get started, is there any administrative stuff that we need to talk about? I always forget like dates of exams and things like that. When's the next exam? It's in 2 weeks? So that means that next Monday, I'll send out example questions for the essay question. And then the exam will be in the testing center in 2 weeks. Hopefully the midterm rush will sort of die down. I saw a picture of the line earlier this week that went out the door, all the way through the testing center, out the door, and like, yeah.
When I was going, it was actually starting to stretch past the McKay building.
It's insane. It's crazy. Would you guys rather have in-class exams rather than...
Yeah, I don't understand testing center at all.
Yeah, I don't really get it either.
Because teachers lecture, like you're studying for the test, and then they'll lecture for like a week straight, and you get behind, you know? Like
Yeah.
the test was open Wednesday through Friday.
Then I'm just going to continue soldiering on.
And then we're
Yeah.
a week behind.
Yeah. Rachel?
Did you ever decide what time our final?
I have not been successful yet in changing the time, so it's the scheduled time right now.
But probably morning.
Yeah, it'll be morning. It's scheduled right now for like 7 to 10 Monday morning, I think. Either Monday or Wednesday. Okay. It's not going to take 3 hours. I mean, I'm not going to be too bent out of shape if you come at 9 and take the exam, as long as you feel that gives you enough time. So, am I going to be bent out of shape about that? Ooh, maybe I will be. Because if your buddy comes in at 7, takes the exam, and then goes to tell you what's on the exam, which question? Well, at that point, it's kind of too late. I'll have to decide what to do about that, whether to require everybody to be here on time or not. Any other questions about administrative kinds of stuff? Do you want to do the exam in class?
I kind of like being able to
Just as long.
fit it into the schedule.
We would probably do better if we took it in here.
Testing center is
Yeah. Well, we could compare performance on exam 1 versus exam 2, and it would be completely confounded with all sorts of things. It would be a horrible study, but...
How long should it take, though? Would we have enough time to take it all?
Ooh, this is a good question. I don't know. How long did it take you for exam 1? It's going to be the same length.
How many, what was it again? You just,
50 multiple choice and then 1 essay question.
I feel like we'd be rushed if we took it in here.
Yeah.
I don't want to be the one that like proponents the testing center, but it's nice to have as much time. Yeah. As we need
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, watch out. They've got their pitchforks out.
Yeah. And I also like being able to decide when I take it. So that's nice.
Okay.
It's okay.
All right, we're going to leave it in the testing center. I'm not going to change it at this
I'm
point.
not procrastinating, but I have like a very like method about studying. That, like I like the testing center.
Yeah, I'm not going to change it at this point. Sorry to get your hopes up if you wanted to do it in class. So it'll be in the testing center. It'll be Monday through Wednesday. Testing center is fairly dead early in the morning, like 10 or so when it opens. It's only later in the afternoon, the evening. It opens at 8. Yeah, you can show up at 8, take the test right before this class, in fact, and then you'd have plenty of time.
Monday it opens at 10.
Ah, well, then Wednesday you can open at 8. So you go right after this class on Monday. Okay, so it'll be in the testing center. I'll send out exam questions, possible essay questions next Monday. There we go. Any other questions about administrative sorts of stuff? Oh, yes. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to let you all know that there is a lecture tomorrow night by Dr. Yamalaki. She's going to be talking about what it's like to be a social and gender psychologist, and it should be good. It should spark some good conversations. And then we also have 2 weeks from tomorrow, Psych Idols coming up. It's our annual talent show. We have professors and students perform. So I thought I'd pass it around to sign up, and if anyone's interested in participating, we'd love to have you see your talents. So
The student performances are typically good. The professor performances are typically entertaining. Might be one word for it. Might be a stretch to call them entertaining. I usually get roped into these things because I go to show support, and they say, Dr. Crew, we're coming up and do judge the marshmallow toss contest, something like that. But it's a lot of fun, actually. Last year, it got sort of preempted by Jimmer Mania. So it was watch Jimmer, and then during the commercials and timeouts, do the talent show really quick, and then watch Jimmer again. It was actually a lot of fun watching the students watch Jimmer. But unfortunately, I think Jimmer lost. So that was the game in the tournament where they got put out. Not to put a damper on things, sorry. All right, so today we're going to talk about visual imagery. And we're going to talk about a 40-year-old debate that nobody cares about anymore, which is kind of what psychology classes are all about, right? We talk about all these old debates that nobody cares about. But it's interesting to think about it in terms of sort of these historical context so that we can figure out, okay, we know that the brain or the mind doesn't work this way. We know that imagery doesn't work this way. How does it, in fact, work? So we're going to talk about what imagery is, what it's like, and what we use it for for the rest of the week, basically. So today and then on Friday. So to give you some examples of what we use imagery for. Imagine Snoopy. What shape are Snoopy's ears? Think about what shape they are. Okay, they're sort of a loop. What color is a bee's head? What color is a bee's head? Brownish, blackish?
Like orange.
If you need to get to I-15, but University Parkway is closed, what route do you take? How do you get there? So, what did you say? Center Street and curse what?
The whole way.
And curse the whole way?
All the
Yeah. I take 8th North. So if you take University Avenue up to 8th North and then 8th North, that's much faster, I think.
You feel like 8th North's faster than Orange Center?
Yes. I do feel like that, although I have no proof. I've never timed either. You go faster on University Avenue, right? And so you feel like you're going faster. Yeah.
That's very true.
Is a leopard's tail more than half the length of its body? Yes? No? Yeah, it probably is. So if you imagine a leopard. Okay, so what are you doing as you're answering these questions? So you're coming up with pictures, right? You sort of come up with these mental pictures. So most people report looking at a mental picture, sort of imagining these things, generating a mental picture, and then examining that picture. So if you generate a mental picture of Snoopy, you sort of imagine what his ears look like. If you generate a mental picture or a mental map of Orem and how to get from here to the interstate, you can think of several different exits that you can take, or on-ramps that you can take. So this implies, but it doesn't necessarily prove, that there's a type of representation in your head, in your knowledge base, that's at least quasi-pictorial. Quasi meaning that it's not exactly like looking at a picture, but it's really similar. It shares a lot of the same characteristics as looking at a picture. So the idea is, and this has been around for quite a while, the idea is that we sort of generate these mental models. That you can come up with a model of the situation in order to test different variables, right? So if I give you a little story, and as you're listening to this little story, you're sort of constructing this mental model. And then some things make sense within this mental model and some things don't. So if I tell you that 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam beneath them, versus 3 turtles rested beside a floating log and a fish swam beneath them, I forget how this is set up. There's this third thing. So these two, which one makes more sense? Let's ignore this one for now because I can't remember what that one's for. The first one makes more sense, right? So if you're constructing this mental model, you've got a log, you've got water underneath the log, you've got turtles on top of the log, and a fish swimming in the water. If the turtles are resting beside a floating log, where are the turtles? They're either in the water, but it's not really resting if you're floating in the water. You'd have to swim, otherwise you're going to sink, even if you're a turtle. So they're probably sitting on the bank. So that's how I imagine this. The second scenario is turtles resting on the bank, water, log floating on the water, fish swimming beneath the log. Right? So people are faster at identifying and agreeing with that one, and you're faster at reading that one, actually. So if I have you read this sentence, press a button when you're done, you actually read this one faster than this one because it's congruent with your mental model.
Them implies the turtles, it implies the log. On the third one.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so, okay. Fish down beneath it. Yeah, I should actually read to the end of the sentence. Yes, so this makes more sense, right? Because this is always going to make sense because in order to be a floating log, you have to be on top of the water. So here they could or could not be on the water, and so it's a little bit ambiguous where the fish is. Jill?
There is an example, I don't know if this is what you're trying to think of, but there is an example similar to this in the book where it showed the first two sentences and then it showed the third and it said, did it show this sentence before? And most people thought that the third sentence
You
was
can
the
confuse
first
this one
sentence.
with that one.
Even
Yeah.
though it was different, people remembered it to be the first one.
Right, because these two are consistent with one another. Fish swimming underneath whatever is on top of the log, or the log or whatever is on top. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. So, do you ever run across instances where these sorts of things are violated? Stephanie Meyer springs to mind. Like bad literature. So when I was a kid, I read this series of books called the Dragonlance Chronicles. Is anybody familiar with these? There are a couple of people. I know that Mike is a huge Wheel of Time fan, so it's not surprising that you've read these books. All right, so I read them as a kid, and I thought they were cool. They've got dragons in them. They've got heroes. It's a complete ripoff of the Lord of the Rings. There's this whole, it's really derivative of the Lord of the Rings. But as a kid, I didn't realize that. I thought that they were just cool, and they had dragons and they had funny characters and things like that. And then in the library a couple of weeks ago, I ran across the whole series, a volume, like the whole series was put into one book. I thought, hey, this is cool. I read this as a kid. I'm going to reread this. And it was awful. It was the worst thing that I had ever read. I couldn't believe that I thought that this was good as a kid. They had things like, the one that just made me want to throw the book away was, they were talking about, trekking through the snow, and in order for the smaller, like, hobbit-like people to, the hobbit derivatives, to be able to walk through the snow, they had to walk everybody had to walk single file, right? And then it talks about the conversations that these people are having as they're walking single file, and the one is walking next to the other one and turns to the one that they're talking to. It's like, wait, I thought they were walking single file. How come they're walking side by side now? That doesn't make any sense. And so you sort of get this to begin with, and then it switches to this. It's like, it's violating my mental model. I can't imagine what this is like. And then there's all the stilted dialogue, and I can't imagine what their emotions are. One second they're friends, and the next second they're drawing swords and trying to chop each other's heads off. Can't recommend it. I'm sorry. I wish I could. One of the authors is a local author too. It's what's his name? Tracy Hickman. Yeah, he's lives around here, and he's gotten better though. This was sort of their first series of books, and it got better toward the end, but they still had to deal with all the inconsistencies earlier on.
Talking about books, I don't know if this fits what we're talking about or not, but sometimes when they say something in the book about one of the movements a character makes and I can't picture it, I do it myself. I don't know why, but I can't even think of an example, but they'll say something kind of complicated and I can't get that, so I kind of do it.
Okay.
But I don't know, I guess that's why I do it. I didn't know why before, but I think it's because I can't picture it.
Okay, so it's difficult to create a mental model, and so you sort of act it out in order to help you with that. No, that makes a lot of sense. So if I give you some instructions, and if I say, imagine opening a peanut butter jar, it might help for you to do this action of, okay, which way do I have to turn does anybody ever have to think of this? Which way do I have to turn the peanut butter jar? Or, in order to get to my house, you have to turn, let's see, is it right or left on University? Does anybody ever do that? Imagine yourself in the situation and actually doing the action in order to be able to give people directions. Because I just know, I turn at Will's Pit Stop or whatever. So and then I have to think, okay, which direction am I facing, and sort of create this mental model in order to be able to do these things.
So if you have to do that, does that mean that a lot of your memory is more procedural than more semantic? Because if you just knew we were supposed to turn off University, just be able to say it, but like actually moving or visualizing. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So early on, early versions of how do we store this stuff said that, well, it's just semantic memory, right? So we've got episodic memory, we've got semantic memory. So for these kinds of mental models, it's all semantic. You can imagine it, you can represent this information in terms of sentences, basically. You have these verbal labels that you attach to things. So to get to my house, you turn right at Will's Pit Stop. Then you can represent that with a sentence. You can represent it verbally, basically. So if you remember our semantic categories, a grandmother is defined as a female parent of a parent. So that's a sentence, right? And you can represent this semantic information as a proposition or as a sentence. So you can also create mental models that are sentences. So it's a lot like creating a computer program. So you have these operators that take two operands. This gets very sort of abstract very quickly. And that's kind of the idea, is that these are abstract representations. They're generally applicable to lots of situations. So if you have the operator on, and then you have the operands, the two, I would call these variables that you pass to the operator, but that's sort of nerd computer talk. That this represents the ball being on the box. So this is a proposition of the ball is on the box. And this may be how we represent these things mentally. So with propositions, they specify the relation, because if you switched ball and box, then it would suddenly be the box is on the ball. And that's different, right? That's a different sentence, and that has a different meaning than the ball is on the box. And syntax matters in that case. So if I say the ball is on the box versus the box is on the ball, there's a different relationship implied there. So the syntax, the order of the words matters. It has a truth value. So it's either true or not. The ball is either on the box or it isn't. They're abstract and they're not spatial. They're verbal. So that's one way that we can represent information is via these propositions. Now what Kyle is saying is that, well, if you have to do this sort of turning mentally, you do your own turning, well, maybe that implies that these propositions aren't necessarily accurate. Maybe it implies that it's not really semantic memory, maybe it's more procedural memory. Maybe there's something else going on. So one possibility for something else going on is an analog representation, or a pictorial representation. So here, this is the representation that you have in your head. It's like a picture, right? So there's no distinct relationship here because it's just a picture, right? It's not relative to anything else. It's just a picture of the state of the world. It doesn't have any syntax. It doesn't matter if you describe the ball being on the box or the box being underneath the ball. And it doesn't have any truth value until you start describing it. And it's only when you describe it that it can be true or false. Because a picture is just a picture. It's neither true nor false until you start saying things about it. They're more concrete rather than abstract, and they're represented in a spatial medium, so as a picture. All right, so which do you think is closer to the truth? Which feels more like what you're doing when you imagine things? That you have a set of propositions, or that you have sort of a picture that you're carrying around? Anybody vote for propositions? Pilishin would be so disappointed. So there's all sorts of people. There's a huge controversy about this, like in the 1970s. And then people started to say, cognitive psychologists started to say, well, we're probably not going to be able to answer this question just by arguing about it because, my introspections basically are different than your introspections. It feels different to me. My data are consistent either with this or that. And it was only really when cognitive psychologists started to pay attention to neurology and neuropsychology that it became apparent that it's probably pictures. It's not really propositions. So as we started to use these converging methods, it ruled out the propositions. And I'll give you some of the evidence, some of the reasons why we sort of rule out propositions, that it's more likely to be pictorial. Danny?
Just like trying to think to myself, when we were going over the bit with the turtle on the logs, I did picture that, and I pictured like the water, and I pictured the logs, and I pictured the turtles and the way they were facing. And then I thought I'd pictured like, a few rocks and plants on the rocks and things like that around it. But when I tried to define where I imagined they were, I just imagined there were some. It wasn't like an image. So could it be like a blend of image and just concept that the image has this, but not where it is in the image?
Could be. I don't know. What do you guys think? So when you were picturing the turtles and the log, anybody picture moss in the scene? Like moss on the log? Color was the water. I sort of imagine
I feel like I pictured
Frogger.
the water was like pure clear, but not what was on the bottom.
Oh, okay. So my mental image looks a lot like that video game Frogger. Really brown logs, really blue water, and the turtles are sort of pixelated.
So, I think I kind of imagine like a stream or a creek that I'm familiar with as a kid.
Okay.
And I do that a lot when I have a similar thing. I just imagine something I'm familiar with.
Something that you've already had experience with.
Yeah.
So if I say, imagine going to the grocery store,
Yeah.
you're going to imagine Macy's or
Yeah.
something that you're familiar with.
Yeah, mine would have right next to my house.
Okay, Sarah?
That's what I was gonna say. I pictured the zoo that I usually go to at home. You walk across the bridge and there's water, and there's always turtles there on logs. So that's what I
Okay.
pictured.
Okay. Okay.
I pictured something that I was familiar with. I didn't play Frogger as much as a child, so I didn't picture Frogger.
So it turns out that if you have hippocampal damage, so if you have memory impairments, guess how you do on imagining tasks? You actually do pretty poorly. So you can sort of get these semantic, oh yeah, turtles on a log, and sort of these broad strokes, but if you ask for details, that hippocampal amnesic patients have difficulty with the details. Probably because they can't do this. Probably because they can't remember things that they've seen in the past. They have memory impairments. And so they can't draw on those memories for imagining future scenarios. So imagery is a lot like memory. And we've talked about how memory is a reconstructive event anyhow, right? So it's a lot like, the process of constructing a memory versus constructing an imagined scenario is very, very similar and draws on overlapping brain mechanisms as well. Tori and then Sarah.
I'm not sure I understand the proposition representation, what that's actually proposing.
So it's proposing that your semantic memories are stored as sentences, basically. So I have a semantic memory that George Washington was the first president of the United States, and that's literally how it's represented in my head, is as a sentence, as that proposition. And it may be, that you have operators, maybe you have first, and then president in the United States and George Washington. Maybe those all fit in sort of that way, but it's all very verbal. It's all very sort of propositional. And so I could have other firsts. I could use that same operator that, first kiss with me was blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to tell you guys who that was. So that operator could be general and generalizable to different situations, but that's a semantic memory, and that's how it's represented. Now, if that's how you represented your first kiss, that would be really tragic, I think. So that would, just sort of make the whole human condition really bleak. And that's really not how it works. So our representations are more pictorial and more sort of experiential. And it's basically you represent the information the way that you saw the information, the way that you first experienced the information. Which is not to say that there's no verbal information in there. You probably learned the fact about George Washington verbally, and so maybe that is represented verbally. But there's, even with that, there is some evidence against it. Sarah, did you have a comment?
Yeah. So, if mental imagery or imagining something is like remembering it, how come you can keep them separate in your head? You don't mix up what you've imagined with what you've done. Like, even as a kid, you were playing pirates or all sorts of things. That was imaginary. It's very real when you're playing it. And it's using the same brain mechanisms. How come it doesn't leak over?
It does sometimes, though. So that's what false memories are, right? So the DRM effect. You didn't hear sleep on that list, but people remember sleep being on the list because it activated this mental representation, and you sort of imagine sleep, and so that sort of leaks over into what your memory is. As we go about, with schemas, for example, you sort of activate this mental representation, and so you remember things being consistent with the schema even if they weren't, even if they were omitted. So it's a great question. Usually we are pretty good at it. But I think that we kid ourselves in thinking that we're perfect at it. We're not. We have a lot of overlap between these things, and so we have a lot of false memories that we don't recognize as false memories because our memory is good. You remember everything that you've ever experienced, right? If I stick an electrode in your hippocampus. No, that's not the case.
Is that kind of the same thing when people confuse dream with reality?
Yeah, it's exactly the same sort of thing. So dreams are in your head. You're not experiencing. A trip to, I was in Budapest last night, and we were going to a member's house, and they were supposed to have a party because it was leap day, and all the missionaries were invited, and we showed up, and they're like, no, we don't have parties for missionaries. That's completely inappropriate. And I'm like, but I'm not a missionary. I'm back. And they're like, oh, well, in that case. And then it devolved that there was Queen Elizabeth there, and it was weird after that. So I know that's not reality, right? Hopefully. But often you sort of have, things that are a little bit less weird that, are more mundane, and you think, did I dream that, or did that really happen? And so you do sort of confuse these things. Just, little facts that you're not really very good at. So we do confuse these things with reality, which actually we'll talk about as a bit of evidence against this propositional theory. So one of the things that we do when we're using imagination is that it looks a lot like the structure of reality. So I'm going to give you a task. I'm going to show you two figures, two objects, and your job is to decide if they're the same object, just rotated relative to one another, or if they're mirror images of one another and rotated. Okay? So just say same or different as quickly as you can. Same? Are these the same? Yeah, they're different. Same? Okay. No, they're the same. These are different. Okay, how did you go about solving this problem? How do you go about...
Mentally rotated the seat.
Okay, mental rotation. So you imagine, hold one constant, imagine the other one rotating, or imagine both of them rotating until they're in the same orientation, and then you can compare the two in your mind's eye, and then you can say whether they're the same or different.
So I was thinking putting them together. In my mind, I just slid them together.
Did you do any fixing before you slid them together? So did you imagine them?
They both just
Okay, so they do rotate relative to one another. Okay. I've never tried to do that, but I mean that's an equally valid way of solving it.
I think I've had something like that before, maybe even in your other class, and I don't know not. But then I took OChem in between, and you have to figure out stereochemistry, so you have to transfer for a month, and I was a lot faster this time. So that's just kind of funny, having some multiple things.
Yeah, there are huge practice effects on this. So part of the Elizabeth, help me out. What's the test for dental? The DATS.
I was like, I need to paint the cubes. Those are the exact same images.
Yeah. So I noticed that on that first one, you were really, quick on the draw. So this is one of those things because dentists have to look at things mirror reversed and imagine, how things are. And so this spatial manipulation is very important in this profession, and you get better at it with practice. So yes, it is something that you get better at. Also, incidentally, it turns out that there are sex effects on this. So men are quicker and more accurate at mental rotation than women are. Don't know why. Maybe they make better dentists, I guess. That would be the only benefit to this.
Isn't there something about that, with maps, where you have to, turn around and map, and, guys don't have to because they can do it in their head?
Yeah, I don't know about that, because if you go to the 10th floor of the Swicket and you look at that map, the floor map of the building, it's rotated 90 degrees, and I always have to do this to figure out where people's offices are. So
I always wondered
I don't know. Maybe men are better at sort of this sort of allocentric navigation, so imagining a map and imagining where you are on the map. rather than egocentric manipulation, where you have to imagine, okay, what turns did I take in order to be there? So those are two different ways of representing spatial information, and people do show a preference for one versus the other. I think that I'm an egocentric, because I have to imagine, okay, you've got to turn right at Will's pit stop, so I have to imagine the turns that I actually have to make. So I don't. In my case, at least, that's not the case.
I don't know if this is true, but I read an article about like the grid cells and stuff with white cells. And they did say that men were better at like having like a map in their head, whereas women remember like specific landmarks. I don't know if that's true, but
Yeah. So that's part of the difference is that egocentric navigation requires these landmarks and sort of landmark-based navigation, whereas allocentric navigation, you've just got this sort of high-level map that you can imagine things. And I often tease my wife that she has no map. I always want her to like draw a map of the neighborhood just so that I can tease her that these streets do not connect with one another. But that would be mean. And I took a pledge. I took a pledge yesterday to be nice. All right, so it turns out that in this mental rotation task, that the farther the two objects are rotated from one another, the greater the degree of rotation, the longer it takes people to respond. Almost as if they were all imagining things rotating in space. So you get this nice linear relationship between the degree of rotation and reaction times. So this is picture plane pairs. So this is if you have an object and the other object is rotated in this direction in the picture plane. This is depth pairs, which is what we just saw. So you have the object and the other object is rotated within the depth of the picture plane. So for both of these things, you get this nice linear relationship. How often do you see a nice linear relationship like this in anything in psychology? Never. This almost never works. And so this is a huge finding back in like the late 60s where this actually started coming out. So the time to answer the question is related to the degree of rotation, which sort of implies that people are actually doing this mental rotation. Now, if you were just representing this propositionally, would it matter how far these things were rotated? It would just be, the operator would be something like object rotated. And so it wouldn't take any more time with a greater degree of rotation. So this implies that things are at least have this pictorial quality to them, that you imagine them rotating in space. All right, so that's the first property that indicates that our mental representations are probably pictorial. The next property is size zooming. So if I give you a series of squares, a brown one, I should actually colorize these, come to think of it. I'll have to redo this figure. All right, so a brown one, a pink one, a green one, and an orange one. Ariel.
Would you even be able to do the rotating thing if you had the other memory?
You should be able to, but it shouldn't be time dependent. I mean, you're not going to imagine them rotating, right?
Yeah, but you haven't necessarily seen that rotation before.
Right, but you know that it's a rotation. So it would be same object rotated would be the proposition, or different object rotated. And so you should be able to, once you figure out whether it's same or different, respond regardless of the degree of rotation. Yeah, it's sort of lacking, right?
Yeah.
So the data are inconsistent with that way of representing the information. That there's no real easy way to fit those data into that theory, which is a pretty good indication that your theory is wrong, right? If the data just don't support it, if your theory can't explain it, then they can't explain it. It's probably not correct. Yeah, so that's a good point. All right, so size zooming, another property. So if I give you a bunch of different squares of different sizes, and I say, all right, imagine a tiger fit inside the pink square. Now, what color is the tiger's nose? And it turns out that the smaller the image is, the longer it takes you to respond to that question. Probably because, well, why? What do you think you're doing?
Make a very detailed, small image.
Right, and so you sort of have to zoom in to get at all that detail. So if it's a great big picture of a tiger, what color is the tiger's nose? Oh, it's black or brown or whatever color tiger's noses are. But if it's a tiny picture, you've sort of got to blow it up first, right? You've got to zoom in on it, and the smaller it is, the longer it takes you to do that zooming in. So, and that's actually what the data indicate, that for both true and false propositions, so is the tiger's nose brown? Yes or no? So for both of those, the largest sizes have the fastest reaction times. It's easiest to answer those. And the smaller you get, the longer it takes you, the longer your reaction times. All right, so that's property 2, that you have to do this size zooming. If it was just propositional, it shouldn't matter how big the tiger is. The proposition is tigers' noses are, what color are tigers' noses? Brown? Black? Pink? Tiger's stripes are black. I hope that's not controversial. So that would be the proposition, and it shouldn't matter how big or small the tiger is, it's always going to be true. So these data are inconsistent again with the propositional idea.
So wait, what were the scores colored?
Just as an easy way for me to tell you which one to imagine. So I could just as easily number them 1 through 4. So size number 1 through size number 4. It's just an easier way to get at them. All right, so that's property number 2. Size zooming takes longer the smaller the picture is. Property number 3 is scanning. And I swear I'm not making this up. Imagine an island. Let's see. Now, let me read this to you so that I get it right. Participants saw and memorized a map of a fictitious island that contained a number of locations. For example, a hut, a well, a rock. The rock may have been black. There's a pond. There's a mysterious hatch. There's a compound with the others. Okay, that part I am making up. All right, so you get this mysterious island, this fictitious island. You get all of these different features on it. So I show you this map. You memorize the map. And then I take away the map and I ask you things like, imagine the map and mentally navigate from one location to another. So for example, go from the hut to the boulder. What do you pass as you're going from the hut to the boulder? And then make a response when you reach your destination. So if I tell you, imagine going from the hut to the pond, that's actually pretty close, right? So your responses are actually fast from hut to pond. If I imagine going from the hut to the boulder, your responses are actually slower for that. If you're just going from hut to boulder, if it's just a proposition, then you should go there instantaneously, right? But the farther things were on the map, the longer it took people to respond to these things, indicating that they're sort of scanning across the map. Or if I ask you questions about the map, is the pond north of or what direction is the pond from the hut? You're faster at responding to that because the hut and the pond are pretty close than the hut and the boulder, because the hut and the boulder were far away from one another. You've got to scan across the map. You've got to scan across your mental representation of the map in order for you to make these responses. And then finally, cognitive psychologists get with the program and start looking at the brain locus. So if these things are represented linguistically, if they're represented in terms of language codes and propositions, then as you're doing these tasks, you should activate language centers. And if you have damage to language centers, you should be impaired at these tasks. Conversely, if you're relying on mental pictures, then visual centers should be activated by these tasks by imagining these things and not language centers. And it turns out that if I ask you to imagine a scene, if I ask you to do mental rotation, things like that, that you activate visual centers, specifically dorsal stream. So up there, my pointer out here. So basically up here, and preferentially on the right, it turns out. But you don't activate things in the language centers. So these are all PET results, basically. So imagery versus baseline are these triangles, and it turns out that you activate these imagery regions. If you have brain damage, so say you have brain damage to posterior parietal lobe, something that's involved in spatial visual perception. If your damage is on the right hemisphere, you end up with a condition called unilateral neglect, where you neglect information on the left. So we talked about neglect in here when we talked about attention, right? That you can't focus your attention on the left. For things that you see. What about things that you imagine? Did we talk about the Piazza Experiment in here? Okay. So the Piazza Experiment is, these are Italian researchers, so that's the Piazza. Imagine that you're in the city square. You're in the middle of town, and you're standing on the steps of the cathedral, and you're looking south. Tell me what you see. Describe the buildings that you see. And so the patients describe the scene, and then they say, okay, imagine you're standing on the other side of the square now, facing the other direction. So for us, imagine that you're standing in front of the Wilkinson Center, facing the HVAC. What sort of things do you see? Okay, that's pretty nondescript. Benches, sidewalk. What buildings do you see? HVAC, library to the left. Okay, so the Smoot building will be over there. So now if you imagine that you're on the other side of Brigham Square, you're on the steps of the HVAC facing south, facing toward the Wilkinson Center. What buildings do you see? The Wilkinson Center, Swicket, library maybe this building if you can see far enough away. Okay, so you can do this task and you can describe basically the whole scene. With these patients, what they described was when they're standing at the green X, they describe all the buildings marked with green dots. When they're standing at the red X, they describe all the buildings marked with red dots. So the whole visual scene was in there. They had the complete mental representation, but just like with the visual information that's coming in, sort of the visual input, they could only focus their attention on half the scene at a time. So the whole scene was in there. It's not like the damage had disrupted the memory representation of the scene. It was all in there. It was just that when they called it up, they could only focus their attention on half of it, even for internally generated scenes. So the point is, just like visual scenes, mental scenes require that you focus your attention on them, and it also shows that the mental image is intact in neglect, and that it's an attentional problem and not necessarily a memory representation kind of problem. All right, so there were, 4 properties that that indicated that visual imagery or mental imagery is not propositional. It's probably pictorial. How about that? What was the first one? Rotation, zooming, scanning, and then the brain locus. All right, that's a good summary for today. Next time we'll pick up on talking what is imagery like. And then what's it for?